Hank had always believed that the most dangerous thing a man could do was assume tomorrow would look like today. That belief had cost him friendships, a marriage, and more Saturday afternoons than he could count. While other men his age were watching football and grilling burgers, Hank was running conduit, rotating stock, testing battery banks, and logging every system in his bunker with the same quiet discipline he applied to everything else in his life. He didn't talk about it, not to neighbors, not to the guy at the feed store who sold him his bulk grain, not to anyone. Operational security wasn't a concept Hank had read about in a forum. It was a principle he had lived by for 31 years, the same way a man lives by breathing, without thinking about it, without needing to be reminded. The bunker existed. Nobody knew it existed. That was the entire point. He had bought the land in his late 20s, a flat, unremarkable stretch of rural property in a county most people drove through without stopping. The house on the surface was modest and intentionally forgettable, a single story with a tin roof, a covered porch, a detached workshop that looked like it stored farm equipment and nothing else. What was underneath it had taken him the better part of a decade to finish, and another 2 decades to perfect. The entrance was through the workshop floor, beneath a section of false decking that looked like it hadn't been moved in years, because Hank made sure it always looked that way. The bunker itself ran 40 feet underground and stretched across a footprint larger than the house above it. Poured concrete walls, steel reinforced, divided into functional zones that reflected the mind of a man who had thought through every variable. A sleeping quarters with a real mattress and blackout curtain. A food and water storage room with floor-to-ceiling shelving. Every item cataloged and dated. Rotation schedules printed and laminated on the wall. A mechanical room housing his battery bank, his solar charge controllers connected to buried panel lines, and his ventilation system with redundant hand-crank backup. A gear prep area near the entrance with hooks, bins, and a workbench. And at the center of it all, his monitoring station, a solid wooden desk, a quality chair, for monitors mounted cleanly on the wall above it, and to his left, the shortwave radio he had owned for over 20 years and tested every single month without exception. The entire structure was a Faraday cage. Every wall, every ceiling panel, every floor section had been lined and bonded to ensure that an electromagnetic pulse would pass over this place and find nothing to destroy. Hank had built it that way from the beginning, not because he was certain an EMP was coming, but because he was certain he didn't want to find out he had guessed wrong. He had been underground for a routine equipment check. When it happened, that part still struck him as almost funny in a way that had no humor in it. After 31 years of preparation, he had been in the right place at the right time completely by accident. He felt the EMP before he heard anything. A deep, low-pressure sensation that moved through the walls like a slow wave, followed by a flicker in his overhead LED strips that lasted less than half a second before his battery systems compensated and the lights held steady. He stood still for a moment with a torque wrench in his hand and listened. The ambient hum that always lived in the background of modern life, the electrical frequency of a powered world, was gone. He had never heard its absence before, not completely, and it was louder than any sound he had ever experienced. He set the torque wrench down on the workbench, walked to his monitoring station, and ran a full systems check with the calm efficiency of a man who had rehearsed this moment in his head so many times it had become muscle memory. Battery banks at full charge, ventilation running clean, water filtration nominal, radio powered and receiving. Every internal system came back green. He allowed himself 60 seconds to sit with that, to let the reality of what had just happened settle into his chest without letting it become panic. Then he got to work. His surface cameras were gone. He knew that without needing to check. Every camera he had mounted above ground was hardwired and unshielded, fully exposed to the pulse. They would have been wiped in the same instant as every other unprotected electronic on the surface. He had anticipated this for years. Stored in a shielded steel cabinet in his gear prep area were 4 analog backup camera units, compact and ruggedized, along with the hardware, cabling, and tools needed to run them to the surface through the conduit lines he had buried years ago specifically for this purpose. The conduit runs were already in place, already routed, already surface terminated at 4 discrete points around the property that a person walking the land would never identify as camera mounts. All Hank had to do was pull the fried units, run new cable through the existing conduit, connect the backup cameras, and seal everything back up. It sounded straightforward. It took him the better part of 2 days. Not because it was technically difficult, but because he did everything slowly and correctly, double-checking every connection, every seal, every anchor point. He was in no hurry in the sense that impatience could cost him, but he was acutely aware with every hour that passed that he was blind. He had no eyes on the surface. He did not know what was happening 40 feet above his head. He did not know what the first hours of the collapse looked like, what people were doing, whether the roads were moving or stopped, whether there was fire or silence or something else entirely. He worked through that blindness methodically, and he did not let himself speculate, because speculation without data was a waste of mental energy he couldn't afford. On the morning of the 3rd day, he ran the final cable connection through the junction box at his monitoring station, powered the camera units one by one, and watched the monitors come to life. He pulled his chair close and leaned forward with his forearms on the desk and looked at what the surface had become. The sky was overcast, a flat gray that gave the footage a washed-out quality that made everything look slightly unreal. The road that ran past his property in the distance was visible on the north camera, and it was empty, not quiet the way a rural road was quiet on a weekday morning. Empty in a way that felt categorical, as though the road had been empty for a long time and intended to stay that way. A car sat at an angle near the tree line about 200 yards out, both doors open, nobody visible inside or around it. Nothing moved. He cycled through all 4 cameras slowly, taking his time with each one, logging what he saw in the handwritten notebook he had opened and dated at the top of the first page. Day 3, he wrote, cameras online. Surface appears still. No visible movement. 1 abandoned vehicle North Road. No fire. No crowds. Overcast. He sat back and looked at the screen for a long time after that. Still wasn't the word he would have chosen if he were being precise. Still implied temporary. What he was looking at felt permanent. He made himself eat a real meal that evening. Not because he was hungry, but because maintaining a schedule was how a man kept his mind from drifting in a direction he couldn't walk back from. He heated a portion of stored stew on his propane burner, ate it at the desk with his eyes on the monitors, and told himself what any rational person would tell themselves in the first 72 hours after a civilizational collapse. People were sheltering. People were scared. The roads were empty because people were smart enough to stay indoors and wait for information that wasn't coming. He told himself that right up until day 9 when the figures appeared. They came in from the east on his camera at 2 feet, moving along the far fence line of the property adjacent to his. There were 4 of them, moving single file, evenly spaced, at a pace that was neither rushing nor wandering. They weren't scavenging. They weren't looking for food or water or shelter. They were covering ground with the kind of deliberate economy that Hank recognized immediately because he had practiced it himself. The movement of a person executing a planned route. He sat forward in his chair and watched them cross the entire width of the camera frame without stopping, without looking around, without any of the desperate improvisation that should have defined human movement 9 days into a total grid collapse. He watched them disappear off the edge of the frame, and then he sat very still for a moment before opening his log and writing 3 words beneath his last entry. Not refugees. Organized. He went back through his footage from the previous days, looking for anything he had logged as background noise, and dismissed. It took him 4 hours, rewinding and replaying, and what he found made the hair on his forearms rise. They had been there before. Not the same four figures, but the same movement pattern. Glimpsed briefly on the north camera 6 days ago. A shape moving along the road edge too purposefully to be a survivor, wandering, and too quietly to be someone calling for help. He had logged it as a possible single individual and moved on. Now, he drew a line between the two data points in his notebook and stared at it. Two separate sightings. Same behavioral profile. Different locations on his property perimeter. He spent the rest of that day and most of the night adjusting his camera angles where the combo positions allowed, trying to expand his field of view to the east and north where both sightings had originated. He couldn't get more than a marginal improvement without surfacing to physically reposition the units, and he wasn't ready to do that yet. Not until he understood what he was dealing with. He needed more data. He needed patience. He had both. What he didn't have, he realized as he finally lay down on his bunk in the early hours of what his watch told him was day 10, was a framework for what he was seeing. Every scenario he had ever prepared for had a logic to it. Panic, desperation, tribalism, resource competition. Human beings under extreme duress were unpredictable in specific and well-documented ways. They fought. They fled. They grouped into protective clusters. They fell apart and then reassembled around whoever was strongest or loudest or most ruthless. What they did not do, 9 days into a total collapse with no power, no communications, no supply chain, and no government response, was move through the landscape in organized patrol formations like they had somewhere specific to be and someone specific to answer to. Hank lay on his back in the dark with his hands folded on his chest and ran the numbers the way he always ran numbers when something didn't add up. Either these people had been organized before the collapse, prepared and positioned ahead of the event, or someone had organized them after with a speed and efficiency that should have been impossible given conditions. Neither option was comforting. Both options pointed in the same direction. He closed his eyes. He did not sleep for a long time. When he did, he dreamed of the road outside, empty and gray, and the shape of something moving along it that he couldn't quite bring into focus no matter how hard he tried to look at it directly. By day 14, Hank had filled 11 pages of his log notebook and developed a system for tracking what he was seeing that went beyond simple timestamps and descriptions. He had drawn a rough map of his property and surrounding area on a blank page near the back of the notebook, marking each camera's field of view with a shaded cone, and inside those cones he had begun plotting sighting locations with small precise dots, each one numbered and cross-referenced to its corresponding log entry. 14 days in, and he had 17 dots. 17 separate sighting events, each one involving between 1 and 6 figures, each one displaying the same behavioral signature, deliberate movement, consistent spacing, no foraging, no communication visible from camera distance, no acknowledgement of the environment beyond navigating it. He had started calling them the walkers in his log, not because he thought it was clever, but because it was accurate and he needed a shorthand that didn't take up half a line every time he wrote an entry. The walkers moved primarily at dawn and dusk. He had noticed, which told him two things. First, they understood light discipline. Moving in low visibility conditions reduced their exposure to observation. Second, whoever was directing them understood tactical movement, which meant this wasn't a group of survivors who had stumbled into coordination out of necessity. This was trained behavior. That conclusion sat in Hank's chest like a cold stone, and he carried it with him through every waking hour of days 15, 16, and 17 while he watched and logged and thought and watched some more. He was eating well, sleeping in disciplined intervals, maintaining his systems on schedule. On the outside, meaning the inside of his bunker, everything was running exactly as planned. On the inside, meaning the part of him that had spent 31 years preparing for a collapse scenario and had never once prepared for the specific shape of threat. Something was shifting. Not panic. Hank didn't panic. But something adjacent to it. A slow tightening, a background frequency of unease that he couldn't fully switch off the way he could switch off a light. He managed it the way he managed everything else. He worked. On day 18, he made a decision that had been building for several days and that he had been deliberately holding off on because he wanted to be sure it was a decision made from logic and not from the part of him that needed to feel like he was doing something. He pulled his shielded shortwave radio from his position to the left of his monitoring station, set it on the desk in front of him, and began scanning. He had a list of frequencies he had compiled over years: military bands, civilian emergency bands, ham operator frequencies, government continuity channels. He worked through them methodically, starting at the low end and moving up, spending 3 to 4 minutes on each frequency, listening through static and silence for anything that sounded like a human voice. Most of it was nothing. Some frequencies carried white noise that had a texture to it, a subtle variation that might have been distant signal bleed, or might have been nothing at all. He logged the frequencies and their noise profiles and moved on. It took him the better part of 3 days, working in 4-hour shifts with breaks to eat, sleep, and check his camera feeds. On the second day, he picked up what sounded like a fragment of transmission on a frequency he didn't recognize from his prepared list. A voice, brief and broken, swallowed almost immediately by static. He couldn't make out words. He couldn't determine gender or age. He couldn't even be certain it was a real transmission and not an artifact of his equipment interpreting noise as signal. He marked the frequency with a red pen in his log and kept scanning. On the morning of day 21, he found Voss. He almost missed it. The frequency was unusual, not a standard band, not a recognized allocation. Something that sat between 2 civilian channels in a range that most equipment wouldn't bother searching because there was nothing officially there. Hank's radio was old enough and good enough that it caught it clean. The voice came through with almost no static, which was itself wrong, because clean transmission at that range in a world without functioning infrastructure should have been impossible. It was a male voice. Middle-aged or older, Hank estimated. Measured cadence, no hesitation, no filler words. The kind of voice that belonged to a man who chose every word before he let it leave his mouth. He was mid-sentence when Hank found the frequency, and Hank sat forward so fast he nearly knocked his coffee mug off the desk. He grabbed his notebook and started writing immediately, getting down every word he could catch in real time. What he captured in those first 2 minutes of listening stopped his hand on the page. The voice, Voss, though Hank didn't have that name yet, was speaking about the collapse in past tense, not as a crisis still unfolding, not as a disaster being responded to, as an event that had concluded according to expectations. Hank wrote the phrase down exactly as he heard it. Concluded according to expectations. He underlined it twice. He kept listening. The transmission was one-sided, a report of some kind, structured like a field update delivered to Superior or to a recording system, clinical and detailed. Population displacement in the affected zone was proceeding at the projected rate. Infrastructure assessment teams had completed their sweeps of 3 designated sectors. Resupply coordination was on schedule. Hank wrote all of it down, his handwriting getting smaller and faster as the transmission continued, and the implications of each phrase stacked up into something he had to force himself not to react to in real time, because reacting would mean he stopped writing, and he could not afford to stop writing. Then Voss said something that made Hank's pen go still on the page. He referenced the pulse. Not as an EMP, not as a solar event, not with any of the language that would be used by someone describing a natural or accidental occurrence. He called it the initiation event, and he cited its yield parameters with precision that included technical specifications Hank had never seen in any public document, any declassified report, any amateur or professional analysis of EMP scenarios he had studied over 3 decades. Yield parameters. Initiation event. Those were not the words of a man describing something that had happened to him. Those were the words of a man describing something he had done. Hank sat back in his chair and looked at what he had written on the page and felt the specific quality of cold that comes not from temperature, but from understanding something you cannot understand. The collapse hadn't happened. The collapse had been executed. He clicked on his recorder, rewound to the start of transmission, and hit play, listening to the whole thing again from the beginning with his notebook open and his pen moving, filling the gaps from his initial real-time transcription and correcting the words he had gotten wrong in his haste. He listened to it 4 times before he stopped. By the 4th pass, he had 3 full pages of notes and a picture assembling itself from the pieces that was still incomplete, but already large enough to be terrifying. The walkers on his cameras were infrastructure assessment teams. The organized movement he had been logging for 2 weeks with systematic surveying, sector-by-sector evaluation of what remained and what was usable. Someone had knocked out the grid, waited for the chaos to crest and begin to subside, and then moved people into position to begin cataloging what was left, not to help, not to rebuild in any conventional sense, to inventory. Hank closed his notebook and sat in the quiet of his bunker for a long time. Then he opened it again, turned to a fresh page, and wrote 2 words at the top. They knew. He underlined them. Then he sat back and stared at the ceiling, and began thinking about what a man does when he realizes that the end of the world wasn't an accident, and that someone out there is already building whatever comes next without asking anyone's permission. He did not sleep. He sat at his desk with the radio on low and the camera feeds running and his notebook open, and he worked through every implication he could identify in a systematic way, writing each one down, assigning a priority level, and then setting aside to reach the next one. The same process he used for any threat assessment. The first implication was the most basic. If the collapse had been deliberately triggered, then it had been planned far enough in advance to require significant organizational infrastructure. You didn't build the capacity to execute a continental EMP event in a weekend. That meant people, resources, time, and coordination on a scale that pointed toward either a state-level actor or something that had been operating beneath state-level awareness for long enough to develop equivalent capability. Neither option narrowed the field in accompanying direction. The second implication was operational. The assessment teams on his cameras were working his area specifically, which meant his area had been designated as a zone of interest for whatever came after the initiation event. That didn't necessarily mean they knew about him. His property had no distinguishing features that would flag it on a map, but it meant they were thorough, and thorough people doing systematic sweeps eventually covered all the ground there was to cover. The third implication was the one he spent the most time with, because it was the one with the most variables. Voss was transmitting on a non-standard frequency with unusual clarity. That clarity suggested either a sophisticated transmission system that had survived the EMP, which meant it was either shielded or post-event deployed, or a network of repeaters already in place before the pulse, which would have required the kind of advanced preparation that made everything Hank had just concluded about organizational scale feel like an underestimate. He added a note beside this implication. Find the transmission pattern. If Voss was reporting on a schedule, Hank wanted to know it. He wanted to be on that frequency every time that voice came through. Information was the only advantage he had, and he intended to accumulate as much of it as he possibly could before he made any decision about what to do with it. By the time the light on his surface camera shifted from the gray of night to the flat gray of an overcast dawn, Hank had 4 pages of implications, a priority list, and a new section in his log dedicated exclusively to Voss transmissions. He made himself eat breakfast, stepped through his morning systems check, and then returned to his chair with a second cup of coffee and his eyes on the monitors. The walkers appeared on camera too at 6:47 in the morning, right at the edge of what Hank was beginning to think of as their standard dawn window. 3 of them this time, moving east along the fence line in the same single file pattern. He logged the sighting with the timestamp and the count and the direction, and then did something he hadn't done with any previous sighting. He watched their faces. The cameras weren't high resolution. They were functional analog units, not surveillance-grade equipment. But at dawn, with the figures close enough to the fence line, he could make out enough. They weren't scared. They weren't exhausted in the way that survivors 3 weeks into a grid-down scenario should have been exhausted. They moved with the straight-backed economy of people who had eaten well and slept regularly and had somewhere to be. Hank added a note to the sighting log. Well-resourced, not survivors. Personnel. He sat back in his chair with his coffee and looked at the empty frame after they had moved out of view and felt the full weight of what he was dealing with settle into him completely for the first time. He had prepared for collapse. He had not prepared for occupation. Hank found the transmission pattern on day 23. Voss broadcast twice daily, once in the early morning. Somewhere between 5 and 6 a.m. based on the 3 mornings, Hank had now monitored the frequency from the moment his watch alarm pulled him out of a light sleep, and once in the evening between 7 and 8 p.m. The transmissions ran between 4 and 9 minutes each, never longer, never significantly shorter. The morning transmission was always a field report format, sector updates, personnel positioning, logistical status. The evening transmission was different in tone, less structured, more deliberate, as though the morning reports were updates delivered upward in a chain of command, and the evening transmissions were something else entirely. Instructions, maybe, or assessments. Hank hadn't fully characterized the difference yet, but he felt it every time, the way you feel a change in air pressure before weather arrives. He had been recording every transmission on the small digital recorder he kept shielded in his Faraday cabinet, the kind of recorder journalists used before everything went digital and disposable. He had 6 hours of Voss on tape now, and he had listened to all of it multiple times, building a picture word by word, phrase by phrase, the way an archaeologist builds a picture from fragments, carefully, without forcing connections that the evidence didn't support. What the evidence supported so far was this: Voss was not operating alone. The transmissions referenced other designations. Sector leads identified by alphanumeric call signs, logistics coordinators. Something referred to only as the board whose directives Voss quoted periodically in a tone that carried the specific weight of a man who answered to something above him and knew it. The operation had a hierarchy. It had sectors, which meant it had geographic scope. It had logistics coordination, which meant it had supply chains functioning in a world that was supposed to have none. And it had a board, which meant it had governance, some form of decision-making structure that had survived the collapse, or more accurately, Hank corrected himself each time the thought formed, had never been subject to it. He was on his 4th cup of coffee on the morning of day 23, sitting in the dark with only his monitor screens providing light because he had started rationing his overhead LEDs 2 days ago, not out of necessity, but out of habit. Darkness felt appropriate, felt like the right condition for the kind of thinking he was doing. When the evening transmission from 2 nights prior gave him something new. He had been listening to the recording for the 3rd time, catching a phrase he had partially missed in real time. The yield parameters of the initiation event had been calibrated to spare designated legacy infrastructure in sectors 4 through 9. Hank stopped the recorder and sat very still, calibrated to spare. The EMP had not been a blunt instrument. It had been a scalpel. Someone had designed it with enough precision to destroy the grid at large while preserving specific infrastructure in specific geographic sectors. The engineering required for that kind of selective yield was so far beyond anything in the public domain that Hank spent 20 minutes sitting with the statement before he trusted himself to write it in his log without letting his hand shake. He wrote it anyway. Calibrated yield. Selective infrastructure preservation. Sectors 4 through 9 unknown location. He drew a box around it. Then he sat back and thought about what that meant for his own situation. His property was rural, outside any population center, off any grid infrastructure that would have been worth preserving. He was almost certainly not in a designated sector. which meant the EMP had hit his area at full yield, which was consistent with what he had observed. Total electronic wipeout on the surface. Complete grid silence. No residual power anywhere his cameras could detect. He was outside the protected zones. He was in the cleared zones. That distinction had a meaning he didn't want to sit with for too long, but couldn't avoid. Cleared zones were where the assessment teams worked. Cleared zones were where the walkers came from. His area had not been spared accidentally. His area had been designated expendable and then designated for evaluation, which in the context of everything else Voss had described meant his area was being assessed for what could be extracted from it or built upon it in the new structure that was assembling itself while the rest of the world was still trying to process the fact that the lights had gone out. He made a note in his log, kept it clinical, kept it in his analytical voice because that was the only voice that was useful right now. Assessment teams in cleared zones likely cataloging resources and infrastructure remnants. Possible secondary phase to follow assessment. Nature of secondary phase, unknown. He underlined the last 4 words. Then he turned the recorder back on and kept listening. It was on day 25 that he heard Cass for the first time clearly enough to be certain it was a separate voice and not a recording artifact or interference bleed from another frequency. He had been scanning adjacent bands during a gap between Voss transmissions, the same methodical sweep he had been running daily since he found the primary frequency, when a carrier signal opened on a band 11 clicks below Voss, and a voice came through for approximately 40 seconds before the signal dropped. Female, young, he estimated late 20s or early 30s, those stress-compressive voice in ways that made age harder to read. She was not transmitting freely. He knew that immediately, the same way he had known immediately that the walkers on his cameras were not survivors. The cadence was wrong for a free transmission, too careful, too compressed. The words coming out in a tight, controlled stream that suggested she was working with very little time and was very aware of that fact. He got most of it, not all of it. The recorder caught what his ears missed, and he played it back 4 times before he was satisfied with his transcription. What she said, stripped of the static and compression, was this: if anyone is monitoring this band, I need you to understand that what you think happened is not what happened. There is a second phase. They are not finished. I cannot transmit long. I am at a location I cannot identify. There are others here. We are not free. If you are safe, stay safe. Do not come looking. Then the carrier dropped and the frequency went back to silence, and Hank sat with his pen above his notebook for a long time before he wrote anything. When he did write, he wrote her words down exactly as she had said them, every one he had captured, and then beneath them he wrote a single line of his own. She knows about the second phase. He stared at that line for a while. Then he added another one beneath it. She told me not to come. He stared at that one longer. The rational part is mind, the part that had spent 31 years building a system specifically designed to keep him alive and hidden and off every radar that mattered, had a clear position on what Cass had just said. She had told him to stay safe. She had told him not to come looking. Those were the words of someone who understood the threat clearly enough to warn a stranger against engaging with it. And a rational man honored that kind of warning, because the person giving it was paying a cost he wasn't paying and probably understood the situation better than he did. The other part is mind, the part that was smaller and quieter and had been getting louder with every day he spent underground watching the world outside as cameras get darker, had a different position. It noted that Cass had transmitted anyway, knowing the risk. It noted that she had said there are others here. It noted that she had said, we are not free. The rational part of his mind told him she had also said, do not come looking, and meant it. The other part told him that a person who truly did not want to be found would not have transmitted at all. He closed his notebook. He opened it again. He turned to a fresh page and wrote at the top, what do I actually know? Then he filled the page. What he actually knew, laid out without assumption or inference, filled less than half the page, and that gap between what he knew and what he suspected was the most dangerous territory a man in his position could occupy. He knew the collapse had been deliberately triggered. He knew Voss was running a coordinated operation with geographic scope and organizational depth. He knew assessment teams were systematically working the cleared zones. He knew Cass was being held somewhere against her will along with others, and knew about a second phase that she considered significant enough to risk transmitting about. Everything else, the nature of the second phase, the identity of the board, the geographic extent of protected sectors, the end objective of whatever was being built, was inference and extrapolation, educated and logical but not knowledge. He drew a line under the list and wrote beneath it, "What do I need to know next?" He worked through it, assigning each item a priority and an avenue of investigation. The transmission frequency Cass had used was now logged and monitored alongside Voss. He would wait and listen and see if she came back. If she did, he needed to find a way to respond that didn't expose his position or alert Voss to the fact that someone in a cleared zone was picking up and recording everything he said twice a day. That consideration had been at the back of his mind since he found the Voss frequency. Receiving was passive and invisible. Transmitting was a locatable signal. Any transmission he made, to Cass or anyone else, carried the risk of being intercepted by whoever Voss's people were using to monitor the airwaves in the cleared zones, and if there was organized and resources everything Hank had observed suggested, they would absolutely be monitoring the airwaves. He was not ready to make that decision yet. What he was ready to do was expand his surveillance. His 4 cameras covered his immediate perimeter and a partial view of the road and fence line. They gave him nothing on the wider area. The town 6 miles east, the county roads that connected the rural properties, the infrastructure that Voss's teams were assessing and cataloging. He couldn't physically extend his camera network further without surfacing and running new lines, which he wasn't prepared to do yet. But there was another option he had been considering for several days and had held off on for the same reason. He held off on all decisions until the timing was right. His pre-1980s truck was stored in the underground vehicle bay at the far end of the bunker, a 1974 model with a carbureted engine and 0 electronic ignition components, fully mechanical, fully immune to the EMP that had stopped every modern vehicle on the surface cold. It ran. He had started it monthly for years, cycling the engine, keeping the fuel treated and the battery maintained. It ran, and it was invisible to whatever had wiped the surface clean of functioning vehicles. He had not been planning to surface yet. He had not been planning to expose himself or his vehicle to whatever was operating above him. But the gap between what he knew and what he needed to know was widening with each transmission and each camera sighting. And Hank had always believed that information was the currency that kept a man alive in a crisis. He had stockpiles of everything else. Information was the one thing he could not manufacture underground. He turned to a new page in his notebook and wrote, "Surface assessment, timeline and conditions." Then he began planning with the same precision he applied to everything else. No trace, no exposure, no indication that anyone had been up there at all. The bunker had kept him safe for 25 days. He intended to make sure it was still safe to come back to. The log had become its own kind of companion. Hank understood that was a symptom of isolation, and he noted in the log itself, which he recognized as a circular behavior, but did it anyway because the log was also a record, and a record had value regardless of the psychological commentary embedded in it. He was on his 4th notebook. The first 3 were filled cover to cover in his small, precise handwriting, every page dated and cross-referenced. The earlier entries detailing systems checks and camera installation, and the first days of surface observation, the later ones becoming denser and more layered as the picture assembled itself around him. He had developed a shorthand by the 3rd notebook, W for Walker sightings with number indicating count, V for Voss transmission with a timestamp. C for cast with a question mark after it, because he still had only the one confirmed transmission, and everything since had been silent on our frequency despite his monitoring it every day without exception. The question mark felt honest. He kept it. Day 28 began the same way the previous 7 had begun. Watch alarm at 4:45 a.m. Systems check, coffee on the propane burner, radio on and tuned to the Voss frequency by 5:10 to catch the morning transmission. What was different about day 28 was that the morning transmission ran 11 minutes instead of the usual 4 to 9, and the extra time was filled with content that changed the shape of everything Hank thought he understood about the scope of what he was dealing with. Voss was not reporting to a regional operation. The transmission referenced 12 sectors across what Hank could only interpret as a national footprint based on the geographic descriptors used. Not coordinates, not named locations, but infrastructure categories and population density classifications that only made sense at a continental scale. 12 sectors, each with its own lead designation, each running its own assessment teams, each reporting upward through a chain that converged somewhere Voss referred to only as central. Hank filled 4 pages during that transmission alone, writing fast and small, abbreviating where he could without losing meaning. When the transmission ended, he sat with his pen still in his hand and looked at what he had written and felt the specific vertigo that comes from realizing the thing you thought was large is significantly larger than you thought. He had been thinking in terms of a regional operation, something that explained the organized movement in his area, the assessment teams, the controlled transmissions. He had scaled in his mind to fit the evidence immediately available to him, and he had told himself that was good analytical practice, not letting the theory outrun the data. The data had just outrun his theory by a factor he wasn't prepared for. This was not regional. This was national, possibly larger. He wrote that in the log and then sat with it. Possibly larger. He underlined it once and moved on because sitting with it longer than a few seconds served no productive purpose, and he had a full day of work ahead of him. The surface assessment plan he had been developing over the previous 3 days was now more important and simultaneously more dangerous than it had been when he started drafting it. More important because the scope of what Voss was running meant the cleared zones were going to transition to whatever the second phase was faster than he had originally estimated. 12 sectors operating simultaneously moved faster than one. More dangerous because an operation of that scale would have more personnel, more monitoring capability, more systematic coverage of the ground he intended to move through. He went back to his planning notes and revised the timeline downward and the caution requirements upward, and spent the morning working through the specifics of a surface run with the methodical care of a man who understood that the margin for error had just gotten significantly smaller. The route he had planned followed the dry creek bed that ran along the eastern edge of his property for about a quarter mile before cutting north through a stand of hardwood timber that would provide overhead cover for most of the approach to the county road he wanted to observe. He had walked that route dozens of times over the years in daylight and at night, and knew every feature of it well enough to navigate it without light if he had to. The truck would stay underground. A vehicle, even a functioning one, was too visible and too audible for what he needed. He was going on foot, in dark clothing, carrying only what he needed, his recorder, his binoculars, a written copy of the key Voss transmission data in case he encountered something that required cross-referencing in the field, and his sidearm in a hip holster, because he was not naive about what was moving to the landscape above him. He had set the surface run for 3 days out, targeting a 2-hour window around midnight, when the walker activity on his cameras had consistently shown the lowest level of movement. He wanted 2 more days of observation data before he committed to the route and the timing, and he wanted 1 more Voss transmission cycle, morning and evening, to see if anything in the content changed his risk assessment. What he got instead of 2 more quiet days of observation was Boyd. He found him on camera 1 on the afternoon of day 29, and he almost didn't recognize him because Boyd had lost weight. He didn't have to lose and was moving with the careful hunch quality of a man who had been living rough for a month, which was exactly what he'd been doing. Boyd was his nearest neighbor, a cattle farmer who ran about 200 acres to the northwest, a quiet man in his mid-60s who Hank had known by sight, an occasional brief conversation for the better part of 15 years without ever telling him anything real about himself or his property. Boyd was exactly the kind of neighbor Hank had always preferred, close enough to be aware of, distant enough to be no concern. He was walking along the fence line that separated their properties, moving slowly, stopping every few steps to look around him with the wide-eyed vigilance of an animal that understood it was prey. He looked terrible. He looked alive. Hank watched him on camera one for 6 minutes before he reached the gate at the near corner of the fence line and stopped there, looking at Hank's property, looking at the workshop, looking at the house, looking at the land with the expression of a man doing a calculation. Hank watched him do the calculation and felt something uncomfortable move through him. Boyd didn't know about the bunker. Nobody knew about the bunker. But Boyd knew Hank's property was here, and Boyd was cold and hungry and scared and standing at the gate with his hand on the latch doing the math on whether anyone was home and whether home was somewhere worth trying. Hank sat very still in his chair and watched and did not move toward the door. The bunker stayed secret. That was not a rule he had written down, because it did not need to be written down. It was a foundation everything else was built on, and it did not have exceptions. Boyd stood at the gate for 4 minutes and 12 seconds by Hank's count. Then he lifted his hand off the latch, looked at the property one more time, and walked away back along the fence line the way he had come, disappearing off the edge of the camera frame into the gray afternoon. Hank logged the sighting with Boyd's name, the first named individual to appear in a log besides Voss and Cass, and sat with the entry for a long time before he wrote anything beneath it. What he eventually wrote was not about Boyd specifically. It was about what Boyd's presence and condition told him about the state of the cleared zones for people who had not been prepared. Boyd was a capable man, a farmer, physically tough, land smart, someone who knew how to work and how to survive discomfort. If Boyd looked the way he looked after less than 30 days, then the general population in the cleared zones was in a condition that was deteriorating faster than even a pessimistic model would have projected. Hank added a note: cleared zone civilian population degrading rapidly. Assessment teams operating in parallel. Timing of second phase likely calibrated to population degradation curve. He stared at that last line for a long time. Then he opened his planning notebook and moved the surface run timeline up by 1 day. He spent day 30 running through the revised plan, checking each element against a new timeline and adjusting where compression created gaps. The route was unchanged. The gear loadout was unchanged. What changed was the preparation window. 2 days instead of 3, and the decision he had been holding in reserve about the radio. He had only listened since the collapse. Contact with Cass had been sitting in his planning notebook under deferred decisions. Choices with variables he wasn't ready to resolve. The Boyd sighting moved it out deferred. If the civilian population in the cleared zones was degrading on the curve Hank now suspected, and if the second phase was calibrated to that curve the way his note suggested, then the window for doing anything useful with the information he had accumulated was not open indefinitely. It had a shape. It had an edge. He needed to know what Cass knew about the second phase before he surfaced, because going up there without that information was going into a situation with a known unknown he could potentially resolve before he had to act on it. The transmission would have to be shorter than anything he had considered. 10 seconds of carrier, a single compressed sentence, then off the air and frequency hop immediately. He had 3 alternative frequencies mapped that sat in similarly non-standard positions relative to the Voss band, places that casual monitoring would be unlikely to scan in sequence. He wrote the transmission text, edited it to its minimum functional form, and read it back until satisfied. 8 words. He could say 8 words in under 4 seconds and be off the air before anyone triangulating had gotten a useful fix. The evening Voss transmission had ended 40 minutes ago. The morning was 9 hours out, the quietest window in the daily cycle. He picked up the handset, dialed to Cass's frequency, and said 8 words into the microphone in a low, clear voice. Then he released the button, rotated to his first alternative frequency, and sat in the silence with his eyes on the clock and his hands steady on the desk. The silence held for 11 minutes. Then the carrier opened on the alternative frequency, which meant she had been listening for exactly this kind of contact and had prepared for it the same way he had. And Cass spoke for 23 seconds in the same compressed control voice he remembered from the first transmission. He wrote every word. When she finished and the carrier dropped, he sat back and read what he had written and understood for the first time the full weight of what he had been sitting above for the past 30 days without knowing it. The second phase had a name. Cass had given it to him in those 23 seconds, along with 2 other pieces of information that reframed everything Voss had said in every transmission Hank had recorded. He closed his notebook over his pen to mark the page and sat in the dark with the monitor screens casting pale light across his face and thought about a man he had been 30 days ago who had believed that surviving the end of the world was the hard part. That man felt very far away. He opened the notebook again. He read what Cass had told him one more time. Then he turned to his surface run planning page and wrote at the top of it, in letters larger than anything else in any of his 4 notebooks, 2 words that changed the nature of everything he was about to do. Not reconnaissance. Hank had written 2 words at the top of his surface run planning page, and then sat with them for the better part of an hour before he let himself unpack what they meant in practical terms. Not reconnaissance. The shift those 2 words represented was not small. Reconnaissance was passive. Go up, observe, gather data, come back. What Cass had told him in 23 seconds on an alternative frequency had moved the objective past passive into something that required a different kind of planning and a different kind of honesty about what he was willing to do and what he was capable of doing alone. He needed to think clearly, and he needed to think without the pressure of an immediate decision bearing down on him. So he did what he always did when he needed his mind to work at its best. He ran his maintenance schedule. Every system in the bunker, checked and logged in sequence, the same way he had done it every week for 31 years. Battery bank voltage and charge rate, water filtration flow and output quality tested against a stored baseline, ventilation filters inspected and one replaced from stock, propane levels logged, food inventory spot checked against a rotation schedule, fuel in the vehicle bay checked, and stabilizer levels confirmed. He did all of it slowly and completely, and by the time he was done, 2.5 hours had passed, and his mind had worked through the problem in the background the way a mind does when you give it a task to hide behind. What Cass had told him broke into 3 pieces. The first piece was the name of the second phase. She had called it reversion, and described it in the compressed language of someone who had limited seconds and needed to be precise. The systematic elimination of unregistered population in cleared zones prior to resettlement by authorized personnel. Hank had written that down word for word and read it back for times during the transmission replay before he trusted his transcription. Elimination of unregistered population. He was unregistered. Boyd was unregistered. Every survivor still breathing in the cleared zones without Voss's people knowing about them was unregistered, and reversion was coming from him on a timeline Cass had given him in the second piece of information, 30 days. She had said, maybe less. The assessment teams were not just cataloging infrastructure. They were cataloging population. Every survivor they had encountered in the cleared zones had been processed, registered into a system, evaluated, and either absorbed into the operation or removed from the equation in a way Cass had not specified but had not needed to. The walkers on Hank's cameras had been doing both things simultaneously, mapping the land and mapping the people on it. Hank had only seen the mapping. He had not seen what came after. The third piece was the one that had kept him awake through what his watch told him was now 36 hours since Cass had transmitted it. She had given him a location, not a precise coordinate. She couldn't do that, didn't have that information, or couldn't risk transmitting it. But a directional reference tied to a landmark that Hank knew, the water tower on the county road 6 miles east, the one he could see from the top of his property on a clear day, had been converted into a relay point for Voss's communication network. Cass was being held in a facility within line of sight of that tower. She had said line of sight specifically, which meant she had a window or an opening with a view, and had been watching the tower long enough to understand its function. Line of sight of the county road tower was an area of roughly 2 square miles, depending on terrain and obstruction. That was not a small search area for one man operating in the dark in a landscape occupied by organized personnel. It was also the only lead he had on a person who had given him the most operationally significant intelligence he possessed, and who was running out of time at the same rate everyone else in the cleared zones was running out of time. He finished his maintenance run, ate a full meal, and slept for 6 hours in a deliberate and disciplined way, setting his watch alarm and closing his eyes with the practiced intention of a man who had learned decades ago that exhaustion was a threat multiplier and sleep was a force multiplier, and the choice between them was not actually a choice. When the alarm pulled him back, he felt the difference immediately. His mind was clear and sequential in a way it hadn't been during the 36 hours of grinding through what Cass had told him, and he sat up on the edge of his bunk and ran through the revised plan from beginning to end in his head before he even stood up. The surface run was now 2 objectives running in parallel. Primary: reach the observation point on the county road and confirm the relay tower's function and the coverage area of Voss's communication network from a ground-level vantage. Secondary: reduce the 2 square mile search radius around the tower using terrain and line-of-sight geometry to identify the most probable location of the facility where Cass was held. He was not going to attempt a rescue on this run. He was not equipped, not positioned, and not informed enough to do that without getting both of them killed. What he was going to do was gather enough information to make the next decision from a position of knowledge rather than inference. The plan had a go time of 11:45 p.m., targeting the midnight low-activity window his camera data had consistently shown over the previous 2 weeks. He had 4 hours before he needed to be staged at the bunker entrance in his surface gear. He spent 2 of those hours on the radio, monitoring both the Voss frequency and Cass's alternative band, and caught the evening Voss transmission at 7:23 p.m. It ran 6 minutes and contained something that accelerated his timeline in a way he hadn't anticipated. Voss referenced a sector-wide coordination call scheduled for 72 hours out. The language around it was different from the routine field update language. This was a convergence of sector leads, a consolidation of assessment data, and the phrase Voss used for what came after the coordination call was initiation of Phase 2 protocols. 72 hours. Hank looked at his watch. 72 hours from the timestamp on the transmission put Phase 2 initiation at approximately 7 p.m. 3 days from now. Cass had said 30 days, maybe less. She had been right about the maybe less. He had not 3 days to plan. He had 3 days total from this moment to go up, confirm what he needed to confirm, develop a rescue approach, execute it, and be back underground with Cass before reversion began in his sector. He sat with that timeline for exactly as long as it took him to accept it, which was not long, because accepting hard constraints was something Hank had always been better at than most people. Hard constraints clarified thinking. Hard constraints removed the paralysis of open-ended options. He had 3 days, clear objectives, a bunker full of resources, and 31 years of preparation. He was going to use all of it. He went to gear prep area and laid out his surface kit, rehearsed 1,000 times, now simply executed. Dark clothing, broken up with irregular shapes to disrupt his outline. his binoculars, the recorder, his intelligence summary condensed to 2 pages, his sidearm with 2 spare magazines, carried because the alternative was not carrying it and the alternative was not acceptable, a small medical kit, because optimism was not a survival strategy, water for 6 hours, no food. He would eat before he left and after he returned, and the wait wasn't worth it for a 2-hour window. He packed each item in the order they would be needed, which also distributed weight most efficiently. He watched his camera feeds and did not think about what could go wrong. He thought about what needed to go right, a shorter and more useful list. When his watch read 11:30, he stood up, shouldered the go bag, took one last look at his monitors, and walked to bunker entrance. The entrance sequence was the same as always. Interior locking bar, crack the door, listen, then through to the workshop floor access point and the false decking. He had run it dozens of times in training. Tonight the workshop was a waypoint, not a destination. He lifted the false decking, climbed through, and lowered it back with care. The workshop smelled of cold air and old oil, and underneath both, the actual outside filtering through the wall gaps, cold October air carrying the specific smell of a world that had been running without human maintenance for 30 days. Dead leaves and standing water, and the faint chemical edge of things that had burned in the first days and stopped burning when there was nothing left to tend the fires. He stood in the dark for 2 full minutes. Nothing moved. He crossed the workshop door, eased it open 3 inches, and looked out at his property for the first time in 30 days. The sky was clear, good visibility for observation, good visibility for being observed. The moon was 3/4 full, and it lit the landscape in a flat silver light that turned everything familiar into something slightly wrong. The way photographs of known places always look slightly wrong because they flatten depth into surface. His house sat quiet and dark to his left. Nothing moved in any direction he could detect. He eased the door open, stepped out, pulled it closed, and moved into shadow line along the workshop wall. 30 seconds of stillness, cataloging every sound. Wind in the tree line, a branch settling, his own breathing, controlled deliberately. Nothing unknown. He crossed the open ground to the tree line in a low, direct line, not running but not walking, covering ground with practiced efficiency. The tree line swallowed him. Nothing unaccounted for. He moved north through the timber by memory and moonlight and reached the creek bed in 11 minutes. He turned east, staying in the shadow of the near bank, and let the familiar ground carry him toward the county road. The creek bed ran straight for the first quarter mile, and then bent north slightly before straightening again, and it was at the bend, where the bank was higher and gave him a natural elevated position, that he first saw the light. Faint and directional, not a fire, not a floodlight, but a partially occluded beam suggesting a shielded source inside a structure not fully sealed against light leakage. It was coming from the northeast, from a direction that put it well off the county road and into the property grid of farms and rural buildings that Hank had only ever seen from his own land or from the road itself. It was also coming from a direction that was, by his estimate, standing at the creek bend with the county road water tower as his reference point, within line of sight of that tower. He stood at the creek bank and understood that his second objective had resolved itself faster than planned. He knew approximately where Cass was. He had been on the surface 41 minutes. He had time. He glassed the light for 3 minutes, confirmed the source location against the tower position, lowered the binoculars, and thought about a man who had told himself this run was not a rescue. That man had not yet seen the light from a building where someone was held with 72 hours, until reversion. He stood a moment longer. Then he turned not toward the bunker but northeast, toward the light, because the plan had changed and Hank had always been better at adapting than ignoring. The arc northeast took him through mixed scrub and old field that had grown up over abandoned farmland, dense enough to slow him, open enough in patches to expose him. He moved with deliberate care, stopping every 50 yards. His eyes were fully adjusted. The landscape settled into flat silver world of moonlight. Familiar shapes rendered strange. He navigated by the light ahead, and the water tower visible above the tree line as a darker shape against the sky. He had covered approximately 300 yards from a creek bend when he found the perimeter. He almost walked into it. Wire running low and dark between recently driven posts. Disturbed soil still visible as a slightly darker tone in the moonlight. He tested it with the back of his gloved hand. Not electrified, just wire. A boundary marker rather than a barrier. This facility had not been built to keep people out. It had been built to keep people in. And whoever ran it was confident enough that they hadn't hardened the perimeter against external approach. Consistent with a world where organized resistance wasn't yet a concept anyone had assembled. He went to one knee and spent 3 minutes studying the structures beyond before moving. What he could see was a converted equipment barn, metal-sided, the kind on every agricultural property in the county. It had been modified. The light came from a gap at the base of a sliding door, narrow and low, interior lighting baffled but not fully sealed. A second structure beyond the barn, a prefab unit with a satellite uplink antenna, independent of the shortwave network. The communications infrastructure was more layered than he had appreciated. One approach worked. A shallow depression running toward the near corner of the barn. 18 inches of cover if he stayed flat. 18 inches was enough. He went over the wire at a low point, crossed the depression, and went flat. 2 minutes of stillness. Nothing changed. He began moving through the depression toward the barn. It took him 9 minutes to cover 60 yards, which was the right pace for what he was doing, and felt agonizingly slow in a way that necessary patience always did when the stakes were high enough to make time feel like a physical thing with weight to it. He reached the corner of the barn and pressed himself against the metal siding and listened. From inside, he could hear something he hadn't been able to detect from further out. Voices. Low, multiple. The specific acoustic texture of a group of people speaking quietly in an enclosed space. Not guards. The register was wrong for guards. Too varied, too subdued, lacking the particular quality of authority that colored even casual speech between people who were armed and in control of the situation. These were the people Cass had described. These were the others. He moved along the siding toward the gap at the base of the door, staying low and crouched beside it. The gap was approximately 2 inches at its widest point, and the light coming through was dim, battery-powered lanterns by the quality of it, warm and yellowish, the kind of light that was being conserved rather than used freely. He could see through the gap a section of the barn floor and the lower halves of several people sitting or lying against the near wall. He could count 4 sets of legs from his position. He could not see faces. He did not need to see faces. He needed to make contact with one specific person, and he needed to do it without alerting anyone inside to the fact that he was outside rather than another detainee. Because if there were guards cycling through the space, he could not see from his position. An audible contact attempt could expose him before he had completed the assessment he needed. He pulled out the recorder, set it to playback at minimum volume, and held it against the gap. He had recorded a 4-second tone on the alternative frequency Cass had used, the same carrier signal pattern she had opened with both times she had transmitted. It was an identifier. If she was in there, and she was paying attention to things the way a person in her situation would pay attention to things, she would recognize it. He played it twice, 3 seconds apart, and then went flat against the siding and waited. 20 seconds passed. 30. He was counting in his head, and had reached 47 when he heard the sound of someone moving inside, the specific sound of a person shifting position with deliberate care, and then a shadow broke the light coming to the gap at floor level. Someone seated with their back against the door, close to the gap, close enough that he could hear their breathing through the 2-inch space between them. A voice, barely above a whisper, so compressed it was almost entirely breath. She said 2 words. You came. He put his mouth to the gap and said 3 words back in the same register. Tell me everything. What came out of that gap over the next 4 minutes, in the quietest sustained conversation Hank had ever been part of, was more than he had gotten from 30 days of surveillance and 6 hours of recorded transmissions. Cass knew the facility. She knew the personnel rotation. She knew that the guard complement dropped to 2 between 2 and 4 a.m., that both guards stationed themselves at the prefab communications unit during that window to run their own radio checks, and that the barn lock during that window was a single padlock chain on the exterior hasp. No electronic component, no backup. She knew this because she had been watching and counting, and remembering for the same reason Hank had been doing the same things underground, because it was what you did when you were a person who refused to accept the situation as permanent. She also told him something about the second phase that his transcription from her earlier transmission had not captured because she hadn't said it. Reversion in their sector was not 72 hours out from Voss's transmission. It had been moved up. It was 48 hours out, maybe less. Hank absorbed that revision without letting it show in his voice or his breathing, because showing it would cost him time he didn't have. He told her he would be back. He told her the window, 2 a.m., the following night. He told her to be ready to move fast and quiet, and to tell the others to be ready too, because he was not leaving people behind in the barn with 48 hours into reversion if he had any capacity to avoid it. She didn't argue. She said one word. Okay. He moved back through the depression the way he had come, over the wire at the same low point, and into the scrub heading southwest toward the creek bed. He was back inside the bunker by 2:17 a.m. He sealed the entrance, ran a check on his monitors, and sat down at his desk. He did not open his log immediately. He sat in the quiet of the bunker with the monitor screens running and thought about what the next 48 hours required him. And he thought about Boyd somewhere out in the cleared zone who didn't know what was coming. And he thought about the 31 years he had spent building a place that was meant to keep one man safe, and whether one man staying safe, while everything above him was decided by someone who called it reversion, was a definition of survival, he was willing to live with. He already knew the answer. He had known it since he stood at the creek bend and saw the light. He opened his log, turned to a fresh page, and dated it. Then he wrote a single line and underlined it and closed the notebook. Tomorrow night it ends or it changes. He looked at the monitors for a long time after that. The cameras showed the surface, sitting dark and still and waiting, the same way it had looked every night for 30 days. But it wasn't the same. He wasn't the same. And tomorrow, for the first time since the grid went dark and the world above him became something he could only watch on a screen, Hank was going to stop watching. Back underground, he ran his systems check, battery banks, ventilation, filtration. Everything exactly as he had left it. He made coffee and worked through the logistics of tomorrow night, a problem categorically different from every previous one. Hard deadline, human variables, binary outcome. 3 requirements. Extract during the 2 a.m. guard window. No alert. Everyone underground before dawn. He worked through the gap between what they demanded and what he had available. The barn lock was a padlock chain. He had bolt cutters in the gear prep area. A heavy-duty pair he had stored for exactly the category of situation where a physical barrier needed to be removed quickly and quietly. 2 hours. Generous if it went cleanly. Almost nothing if it didn't. 1.5 miles cross-country. Manageable for a healthy person. Potentially not for people held on Voss's rationing for an unknown stretch of time. 4th requirement. Assess physical condition on contact and adjust pace accordingly. Cass hadn't given him a number. He planned for 4 to 8, which meant group movement through unfamiliar terrain at night. A different risk profile than moving alone. He drew the route in his notebook, marked decision points, identified 2 alternatives that traded cover for open ground, and worked out the criteria for each. By the time he finished, it was past 4 a.m., the north camera showing the first gray suggestion of dawn. 22 hours awake. He set his alarm for 10 a.m. and lay down without undressing. For the first time in 30 days, what kept him from sleeping was not fear or calculation, but something quieter. The lower halves of people sitting against a barn wall in the dark, reduced a category of detainees by a system with a name for what it planned to do to them. He was a Category 2, unregistered, cleared zone, subject to reversion. The difference between him and those people was a hole in the ground and 31 years that most people had called paranoia. He didn't feel vindicated. He felt the weight of it. Sleep came, heavy and dreamless. The alarm pulled him back at 10 a.m. with the clarity of a man who had slept with purpose. He ate, ran his maintenance check, reviewed his plan. The walkers appeared on camera too at their standard window, and he logged them. Some habits were worth keeping regardless of what else was changing. He prepped his gear with additions for the extraction, bolt cutters, 2 extra water bottles, a second medical kit. Sidearm checked twice and holstered. The Voss morning transmission at 5:14 a.m. contained nothing unanticipated. Sector updates, logistics, the bureaucratic language of an operation moving toward phase transition with the confidence of something that had never been challenged. He recorded it anyway. At 11 p.m., gear check, systems check, camera review. He stood at his monitoring station and looked at the 4 screens one last time. The same images he had watched for 30 days from the safety of everything he had built. He shouldered the go bag and walked to the entrance. The bunker had done its job, kept him alive long enough to matter. He sealed the inner door, moved through the passage, lifted the false decking. Cold October air came through the gap. He climbed up, sealed it back, and stood in the workshop for his 2 minutes of listening. Nothing unaccounted for. He eased the workshop door open and stepped out into a world 31 days into the end of everything, where someone called what was coming reversion and believed no one was going to stop it. Hank walked into the dark and did not look back.